Damaged Defenders by Sherza. Chapter 123. Darcy. With one of the more stubborn and prone to ignoring everything Science Squad members away doing other things, Darcy had thought she'd be in for a bit of a lull in her activity level. She had quickly been disabused of that notion. Someone, and she was betting it was Tony, had tattled on her to the PR division, which had promptly been all too willing to make use of her poli-sci degree and avowed fondness for social media. Given the voodoo Darcy knew for a fact was going to be hitting the fan, she hadn't even tried to demur. If she was really honest with herself, she had actually looked forward to her time on the PR floor. While it wasn't exactly what she'd originally planned to do with her life in the wake of getting that degree, it was a very close approximation. Better, it was in much better conditions than Darcy could have ever hoped for, short of managing to get hired by the POTUS. SI's PR floor had what amounted to on-call rooms, for goodness sake. Rooms with bunk beds and attached bathrooms for people to crash out in when things got nuts and going home wasn't an option. She'd been slotted into one of the existing groups watching The Hill as an extra pair of eyes, legs, and an analyzer of data. The team was one of the smaller 5-man teams, specifically one of the information acquisition teams. They generated the information that the media teams required to create their magic with media statements, advertisements, etc. She'd had a lot of fun working with them over the last few days. The dam had finally broken a little after dusk, NYC time, when the Van Nuys troop transports and their escorts had arrived. As they, unlike Thargina and Go, hadn't even bothered to attempt stealth in their arrival, they'd been spotted by pretty much everyone with a telescope or satellite focused on the right area at the right time. Darcy was fairly sure that some folks in governments and even more woke camo were seriously considering aiming rockets, or worse, in the ship's direction. Pepper had immediately called a press conference for first thing in the morning, which was going to be all kinds of fun, and Darcy got to be there for it along with Natasha. Oh, and Dr. McCoy. Darcy had giggled for a good 5 minutes straight when she heard who Pepper had picked as representatives for the X-Men and Avengers. There was absolutely no chance that Pepper wasn't trolling the holy hell out of the press and the world in general with that pair-up. Natasha succeeded in being terrifying without even appearing to have to try, despite not being physically imposing in the least. Hank, on the other hand, pretty much embodied everything people were scared shitless of in mutants. He was freaking huge, physically imposing as hell, and looked only vaguely human if you squinted just right. Yet he was one of the sweetest, gentlest, most inoffensive people Darcy had ever met. Not to mention one of the smartest. The press were going to take one look at that pair-up and glom on to Natasha, who was short and petite and, more importantly, female. Because despite having dealt with Pepper and other fierce females for years, the press persisted in considering women easy targets. Natasha was going to destroy them. It was going to be glorious. Darcy had to represent the Geek Squad. Normally that would be Tony, but since he was busy at the moment, someone else got drafted. The rest of the Geek Squad were bad choices for one reason or another. Unfamiliarity with Earth in Loki's case, the chance of a Hulk out due to someone else's stupidity, or just not being good at handling the sort of pressure the press could bring to bear, all of which meant Darcy had gotten the nod. With that in mind, she'd torn herself away from the PR floor earlier than she had the last couple days with the intention of getting some sleep. But first, she checked in on her geeks. She was worried about Eric, and she wasn't the only one. Clint at least seemed to be handling the whole mind-controlled minion thing. Whether or not he actually was handling it, Darcy wasn't sure. Eric, on the other hand, had visibly started to fall apart at the seams despite everything she, Jane, and Thor, not to mention the rest of the Avengers, had done to try to help him. Fortunately, Sam's arrival seemed to have at least slowed down Eric's crash, if it hadn't stopped it entirely. Still, Eric was... yeah. There were a few screws loose in there at the moment, and it was worrying. She She found him sprawled half across the table, sound asleep, whiteboard marker in one hand and drooling on a couple sheets of paper covered in writing she couldn't get a good look at with him sprawled all over them. The whiteboard behind him was covered in incomprehensible scribbles. They weren't incomprehensible because Darcy didn't understand the science behind them. Whatever that mess was, Eric seemed to have been writing in more than one language. She recognized 2 or 3 different languages, going by writing differences since she couldn't read them, and what looked like runes, of all things, in the mess, alongside a ton of half-finished, really complicated-looking mathematical formulas. Fortunately, he'd fallen asleep in a rolly chair. With a little careful effort, she managed to tip him back into it and roll him to the cot at the back of the lab, then dump him into the cot and cover him up without waking him up. She tidied up the papers on the table, but left them out where Eric could find them in the morning. "Jarvis, once I'm out of the lab, cut the lights, would you? And make sure someone brings him some breakfast, since I won't be able to," Darcy said quietly. "Oh, and if you'd record all of what's on the whiteboard and ask Jane if she can make heads or tails of it when she comes in tomorrow." "Of course, Miss Lewis," Jarvis said. The rest of the Star Lab was empty. Thor had probably dragged Jane off. Darcy both tried not to imagine why and not be envious as all hell, because seriously, her mind went places, okay? And it was glorious. She'd seen enough of the merchandise to work with, but at the same time, "But Darcy!" because Thor was not hers to mentally drool over. Bruce and Betty's lab was dark and quiet when she peeked in, indicating they'd taken themselves off to bed already. Not unusual for that duo. Tony's lab, though, was brightly lit, visible through the opaque window in the door, which gave her pause. While Tony had given all of the Geek Squad, as well as John, permission to be in his lab whenever, Darcy could count the number of times someone had been in the lab when Tony wasn't, on one hand with fingers left over. Far as she knew, nothing had happened to upset John recently. Interesting how his need to play with fire had dropped dramatically since he arrived at the tower. Maybe someone hadn't actually gone to bed the way she'd thought. Tony's lab had fabrication equipment, and if they needed something, well, whoever it was past midnight and therefore bedtime. The door slid open at her approach, and she stopped, dead in her tracks in shock. It wasn't one of the Geek Squad. Or, well, not a member of the Midgard Geek Squad, anyway. Because despite not really looking or acting the part, Loki definitely qualified as a geek. And it was Loki in the lab, standing in the center of the open space between the work tables. He was surrounded by a miniature nova of green and gold magic, even his eyes glowing with an expression one of fierce concentration. Floating in the glowing magic was... Well, it took Darcy a moment to figure out what it was she was saying, mostly because she was doing the bug-eyed routine at the display of magic. If there was one thing Darcy had figured out about Loki, it was that he had a tendency to conceal just how powerful he was, magically. They'd been told repeatedly that he was one of the strongest mages in the realms, but he tended to stick to minor little bits of magic. Whether that was just him conserving his strength for when he really needed it, or him trying to avoid conflict by not flaunting his magic, fuck you very much, Asgard in general, and Odin in particular, Darcy didn't know. This? Well, Darcy had no idea if this was Loki really putting his back into his magic, but it was definitely about 10 levels above anything else they'd seen him do so far, except maybe those fireballs when Forbody showed up. It was awesome and awe-inspiring. As for what he was working on, Darcy finally figured out that it was the component parts of Clint's arrows, the shafts and the separated heads. As Darcy watched, some started to be marked by glowing runes, only to be flicked away and replaced by unmarked ones which got marked in their turn, at a rate of speed that was dizzying. Darcy took a couple steps back, well aware that unexpectedly disrupting what Loki was doing could prove horrifically disastrous. "Jarvis, do me a favor. Start some kind of really discordant noise, really low and quiet, but start to jack up the volume until he responds to it. I don't want to call out to him and startle him," she whispered quietly. "Of course, Miss Lewis," Jarvis said equally quietly. Jarvis started up the requested noise so quietly that Darcy couldn't even hear it at first. Once it got a bit louder, she grinned. He'd gone for a noise that sounded remarkably like a machine breaking down and started it from a speaker near the fabrication machines. Given that Tony's fabricators had been going near non-stop and were in fact going even now, it was a brilliant choice. It took less than half a minute for the noise to garner Loki's attention. The ferocious look faded away, as did the frankly impressive display of magic, as Loki turned toward the fabricators without realizing Darcy was just outside the door.
Hey, Loki, she called. Sorry about interrupting your groove there, but it's getting pretty late.
Loki turned back towards her, blinking a bit owlishly for a few more seconds before he apparently got with the program. I see. So Stark's machines are not, in fact, breaking down.
Nope, Darcy said. I just figured yelling your name or anything like that might not have been the best idea. If Harry Potter has taught me anything, it's that screwing up magic tends to end really, really badly.
Loki let out a laugh. Quite so, he agreed.
So what was it you were doing? Darcy asked. I mean, I recognized Clint's arrows, but...
For a moment, it looked like Loki was going to clam up and refuse to say. Then, after a moment, he sighed. I owe Agent Barton and Dr. Selvig a weregild. I sincerely believe both of them would refuse a literal weregild outright. Darcy cocked her head. Weregild. She'd heard that term before, when she'd been reading up on the Norse gods in the wake of Thor's first trip to Earth. Now what? Oh! Right! Old term for you break it, you bought it, basically. Only it was applicable to people as well as things. And yeah, she could definitely see both Clint and Eric point blank refusing such a thing. Like money would make what they'd been through all better.
Yeah, I can see that. So you're... What?
Darcy asked. I know not what to do for Dr. Selvig, but a workable solution in Agent Barton's case was quite a simple matter. His weapon of choice, being long range, runs out of ammunition. Unlike most Midgardian firearms, there is only so much ammunition he can carry at any one time, so I am in the process of enchanting both the arrows and his quiver to enable him to have, I believe the Midgardian phrase is bottomless clips. At any rate, once I have enchanted the quiver, the heads and shafts will be replaced as they are used. Further, any undamaged shafts and reusable heads will be returned here to be used again.
Loki told her.
Wow. Just wow.
And apparently he had to enchant the shafts and heads individually, hence the rather stunning display when she'd walked in. Yeah, Clint is going to love that. Only ever having to lug around a single quiver and never running out of arrows? Yeah, that will definitely make him a happy camper, Darcy said. She wasn't sure about it getting Clint to forgive and or trust Loki, but Clint had already been making a point of not being antagonistic with Loki. This would make not flat out hating Loki that little bit easier, maybe. Darcy didn't know Clint all that well after all. He was one of the quieter, more private Avengers. And the phrase you were looking for is bottomless magazines. You were close. The containers that hold bullets for guns are sometimes called clips, mostly the ones for handguns. The stuff civilians can buy and use. Magazines is used mostly with military-grade guns because the containers hold more bullets, I think,
Darcy told him. Loki visibly filed that information away. Thank you, he said. Learning the idioms of any language can be quite challenging.
Darcy chuckled. Yeah, I'll bet. I only speak a few words here and there of a few languages, mostly cuss words, yes, no, and sorry, don't speak the language.
She started heading for the elevator. Loki followed, after cocking an eyebrow at her to make it clear he knew what she was doing and was humoring her. Darcy grinned right back at him.
So that's what you've been working on lately, huh? I know Tony's been making or buying, well, a metric ton of everything he can think of. Bullets, replacement bites and their parts for Natasha, replacement web spinners and parts for Peter, so on and so forth. Last I looked, he had an entire container of shafts and another of heads for Clint's arrows. You looked to be going at a pretty good clip, but I don't think even at that pace you'd have got everything done today.
And now Loki was giving her a funny look, like he wasn't entirely sure she was real. Which, on reflection, Darcy decided made clear that Loki had probably been downplaying his magical ability to avoid conflict, rather than conserving his strength. Could she pretty please shake her on top and go back to Asgard with her Tangiser, thanks muchly, and fry Odin with it, while bitching him out? God, talk about pissing her off.
What? That was awesome to see, Loki. I know you're used to people being assholes about magic, but most folks here on Earth get a kick out of that. Even the fake stuff, like what David Copperfield does. Admittedly, it probably drives science types bonkers, but that's mostly because they want to know how things work. So unless you're ready to answer like 10,000 questions, I wouldn't let Tony or Jane see you doing that. Bruce and Betty both seem to have a little more self-control than Jane and Tony, so you'd probably be safe from getting bombarded with questions if they saw that.
And yourself? Loki asked.
Totally have questions, Darcy admitted. I just have enough self-control to not blurt them out and demand answers.